So far, we've only briefly touched on the web layout of a transaction. Let's take a closer look at how this layout is built by default. Every screen is built using controls. To the right, we can see a toolbox listing both simple control types and container controls. That is, controls that will contain other controls. If we analyze how this transaction's layout is built, we see the outermost control, the one that contains all the others, which is named main table. It's a responsive table. There's no need to understand what this means for now. It is a table that, as we can see, has 3 rows and a single column. In fact, if we open the Properties window, we see in this top section of the window the 3 rows indicated, and in the bottom section, the properties of this table. Inside the first row, it contains another table control with this name. It is also a table, this time with 2 rows. In the first row, there is a text block control, which is the type of control used to display text. In its properties, we find one called caption, which will contain the text to be displayed on the screen. This is how it looks at runtime. The transaction layout corresponds to this entire section of the screen. The rest will come from what is known as a master page object. If we edit the first record and press confirm without making any changes, we see this message. Let's check which control it corresponds to in the layout. It corresponds to the error viewer control, which is located in the second row of the table. Then, in the second row of the main table, we have another table that will contain the attributes. And in the last row, there will be an action group control, which was given this name. It is a group of actions which here on the right-hand section of the layout screen will correspond to these 3 buttons, which at runtime appear like this. What about these other actions, such as navigation and the selection list? They belong to another action group, named toolbar. The coding that defines what happens when a user clicks on any of these buttons is embedded within the transaction but is not visible to the developer. GNexus adds it. Now let's focus on the central table containing the information of this transaction, which is what differentiates it from others. If I place the cursor here, we can see that the control type is attribute variable. By default, each attribute in the transaction structure is placed one after the other. Attribute Apaca variable controls are input or output fields, whose content is consistent with their data type. That's why for attraction id, which is of type numeric, it appears this way. And for attraction photo, which is of type image, it is displayed differently. If we edit the properties of this control, we can see that the control type is set to image. On the other hand, if we edit the control properties for attraction id, we can see that it is of type edit. In fact, all other attribute controls, which are numeric or varchar, will be of type edit. This means they will be input fields unless they are read only. The user will be expected to type a value there. If we take a numeric attribute such as category id and open the control type combo box, we can see all these available options. For example, Instead of requiring the user to type a number there, we can let them choose a value from a combo box. A simple one, or in this case, more appropriately, a dynamic combo. Because category ID is a foreign key of the category table, we can configure the field so that the user doesn't have to type a valid category ID manually. Instead, they will be shown a list of categories from the category table in the database, and will be able to select one. Thus, by selecting this control type, additional properties appear. In particular, item values, which indicates that the values it will take are those from the category ID attribute from the category table. We must indicate which description will be displayed in the combo for each value. To display the name, we select that of the category name attribute. By doing this, we no longer need the inferred category name attribute on the screen, because it will appear in the combo box, so we delete it from the layout. If we now run it, we can see that for the category the attribute control, the descriptions of the categories currently available in the database are being displayed in the combo box. What will be saved in the attraction table for the selected record is the ID corresponding to that category name. Note that we can no longer leave an attraction without a category. To allow that, the combo box would need to include an empty item. To do so, we enable the empty item property. Run it again. There we now see the none option, which will set the category ID field to 0, allowing us to leave the category unspecified if we choose to. Something important to highlight: when the developer modifies the default layout, from then on, all the changes made at the structure level or source of the transaction will not be automatically reflected in the layout. For example, we just deleted category name in the web layout. However, if we go to the source of the transaction, it's still there, as it is in the structure. And if we now add an attribute from the source, or it could also be from the structure, it will no longer be added to the layout, because by modifying it manually, we lost the synchronization that existed. In these cases, where we manually edit the web layout, we say the dynamic behavior between the structure and the layout is lost. This is clearly identified through this icon, which shows in red that the dynamic link no longer exists. We can recover it, that is, restore the default layout, so that any changes made in the source or structure are once again reflected in the layout. Keep in mind that doing so will discard any manual changes we made manually to the layout. We do this from the Edit, Apply Default menu. Now we can see that what is shown again matches the structure of our transaction, removing all manual changes we had made on this screen. We can identify that dynamism has been restored by this green icon. We have seen how, for each attribute in the transaction structure, GNexus automatically creates a control in the web layout. We must be able to distinguish the attribute in the structure from the attribute control, that is, the attribute as a control in the layout, because although they are related, they are not the same. As we will analyze, they have different properties, some specific to each one and some in common. For example, if we look at the properties of the category ID attribute, we see all those in the type definition section, which define characteristics of the attribute in the database. This will have nothing to do in the properties window of the category add attribute control. In the same way, for the category add control, there are properties like label caption, which does not exist for the attribute. However, note that the attribute has this property, which by default is category D. If we now edit the properties of the attribute control, we can see that label caption has this value. What does this equal sign followed by this value mean? It means it takes its value from the title property of the category id attribute. That is why this label appears next to the control at runtime. Now let's pay attention to the properties under the control info section of the control, the same ones we had modified earlier. We may be surprised to find them also at the attribute level. But what's the point of having an attribute with properties that relate to its use as a control? The purpose is to define the default values. That is, whenever the attribute must be placed as a control in any layout, its default values are taken from here. Let's look at an example. We'll switch the control type back to dynamic combo for the category ID control. As we saw earlier, when we apply the default and restore the dynamic behavior, the category id attribute control reverts to the type edit, as it was initially. That's because it takes the value defined in the control type property of the category id attribute. If instead we wanted the default to be a dynamic combo, we would have to change it at the attribute level. Once we do that, we see that not only are those properties automatically assigned to the control, but it automatically had the intelligence to remove the control corresponding to the category name attribute. We must keep in mind that what we did at the attribute properties level will cause the category id attribute to appear as a dynamic combo box in every object where it is placed as a control. If, in addition to attraction, we had other transactions where category ID is a foreign key, it would make a lot of sense. However, we must be careful with the category transaction, where the attribute is a primary key. In that case, it should not be a dynamic combo box. Therefore, we should change it at the control properties level. To control type, edit. Because if we mistakenly change it directly in the control properties within the structure, either through the source tab by setting these properties to control type edit, or as we did before, by going to the attribute properties from the structure tab, it will be changed globally for the attribute, and thus also in attraction. We'll now revert everything back to its original state.